Welcome to Monday Morning Coffee with Inside the Firm. Each week, our hosts will be interviewing local, regional, and national business leaders to give you an inside peek into how they lead their business to success in the ever-competitive business climate.
Welcome to another episode of Inside the Firm. I am your host, Alex Gore. We're here with a Monday morning coffee episode with a special guest, the President of NCARB. His name is Jon Alan Baker. He's a principal with DLR Group, an integrated international firm delivering architecture, engineering, interiors planning, and building optimization. He specializes in the designs of planning of educational facilities throughout Southern California. Jon, welcome inside the firm.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
How's the weather out there?
Today and all last week has been beautiful. We might actually get a little bit of rain, but nobody really gives us much sympathy when we do, because that's about as bad as it gets.
No one cares, and everyone is
Exactly.
upset. Jonathan Segal, one of the architects out there that's also a developer, people always complain like, we can't do buildings like him because of, we're in Minnesota and the climate doesn't allow us to do awesome buildings like that. And obviously there's awesome architecture in Minnesota as well, but if you get the good weather, then you get the grief for having the good weather as well.
Goes with the territory.
Yeah. So let's back up, and could you kind of give us the background of maybe your relevant experience of what got you from where you were to, going into architecture, and why you wanted to take this path into NCARB as well?
Well, it's at the risk of making a long story. I got interested in architecture when I was a freshman in high school, taking a drafting class, and at the end of our first year, the instructor gave us an assignment to design a house, and it's probably the most fun I ever had. I've never looked back. There's never been anything else I've considered doing but becoming an architect from that point forward.
That is awesome.
So I got a great opportunity throughout my high school career to really just sort of go into a deep dive into drawing our house plans and architectural details and all kinds of things like that. Spent summers framing houses and pouring concrete, and got a real great understanding of how buildings go together through that process. And it was a lot of fun, and I still enjoy it. It's still probably the most interesting pastime I have.
Jon, are you aware of the knowledge gained through osmosis of being out in the field and how valuable that is? Because I'll ask you where you went to architecture school, but you might have remembered a details class where they draw the sections, and your professor is drawing the sections. And I mean, it kind of hits, but it kind of doesn't. But if you're out in the field watching a building get built, it actually simplifies everything. Forces stack on top of forces, water goes away from the building. What do you feel about that construction experience for yourself, and do you recommend it for others?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I don't really have much college experience. And so the idea of sitting in a classroom and being academically pumped full of knowledge and information wasn't ever really my strong suit. And so I spent a very short amount of time taking a few classes at Cal Poly in Pomona way back in the old days, but really for a variety of reasons, I never continued. So virtually all of my career has been learning on the job training. And so I fall into one of those categories. There are people who learn extremely well in an academic setting. They learn by listening, they learn by those things. I learn best by doing. And I think there are a lot of people out there like me, especially in the architectural profession, because we have to know what we know, but we also have to know how to do things, because we not only take ideas and design and create from those ideas, but we also have to create something that you can actually build. We have to prepare details and drawings to instruct contractors on how to build things. And so there's a professional side of it, and then there's actually I guess more of a practical application to our work that we have to do that fits really nicely when you learn on the job. So I learned by working in architectural offices over the years. I learned by working in the field during construction. variety of things like that.
Yep. And definitely architecture has art in it. And some people like to say it is art, but art can be created for art's sake. A building isn't
Yes.
created just for itself sake. It has forces, it has programs. It's not just for its own enjoyment, essentially.
Well,
There's
that's the best part about being an architect is we get to be artists, but we also get to transform the landscape for years and years after we're long gone, and to be able to create ideas and in such a way that you can build them and they can withstand the years of use and provide experiences for people that use those buildings is it's a great thrill, honestly.
Yeah. What was your process of when did you get to DLR Group?
Well, that's another long story, but long story short is I had a partnership here in San Diego, and decided at a certain point in time it was important to address a ownership transition, and for us that looked like an outside sale. So about 2 years ago, we actually sold our company, which used to be called the Baker Nowicki Design Studio, to the DLR Group. So I've only had a short stint of time with DLR.
So this is very interesting because not a lot of people address it on podcasts and stuff like that. And obviously you don't have to go into the numbers, but generalities would be very helpful to the audience. Meaning when you sold, how did you evaluate your company? How did you look for people to buy? What were the terms in general about, hey, you have to come and, do you have to work for 10 years, 5 years? Can you just split? Dive into that process because as architecture firm, especially small architecture firms, they should be building their practice so that it can sell, so that it doesn't just dissolve at the end and you get nothing besides your work and money during that time for it. It is a business as well, and it should be taken seriously.
Ownership transition is complicated, and for probably all businesses, it's extremely complicated for architects, and most architects don't really plan too far in advance for that sort of thing. We did. We planned for that a decade in advance, so we knew what we were doing. We were about a 30-person office, focused on public schools. We had our specializations. We had a very well-run operation. So that's sort of the starting point to be a marketable commodity if you decide to go out on the market. What we did from the standpoint of making a decision on how to sell the firm, we hired an outside consultant to do a firm valuation for us. And there's a lot of firms nationally that do that. We interviewed 3 firms, 2 national firms, and one that was specialized mostly in California, but also worked across the country from time to time, and ended up selecting that individual who really went through all of our profitability, our client base, our strategic plans, our business plans, our financial performances, and developed a valuation model that would make sense when going out on the street to talk to firms that might be looking for an acquisition. And so that's where we started that process. We ended up signing a separate contract with them after that to go ahead and represent us. And so we had that firm represent us out on the marketplace and find us a buyer. And that's the approach we took. There's a lot of moving parts. There's the tangible financial aspects of business and performance and profitability and all that sort of stuff. There's market penetration, there's specialization, there's goodwill, all those kinds of things play into the fact, and some are more tangible than others, but they all create a valuation of the company in the end.
And 30 is a pretty hefty number where one person leaving isn't probably the main driver of all the income coming in. But was there discussions about that, about keeping you on for however long? Did that come into the negotiations?
Yeah, I had one. My primary equal partner, Rich Nowicki, and I started the firm. We had two junior partners that were a smaller percentage of ownership, but they were kind of the first line on our bench. And so the four of us agreed with DLR to remain with the practice for a certain duration. So we're in the midst of that at this point in time, really to help with the transition and the integration of the two firms, systems and employment practices and market penetrations and things like that. And also to make sure there's a smooth transition between all of us and the new firm, so that we don't drop the ball in that process for them.
For that integration, how was letting the whole staff know? Any lessons learned from there? And then integration, was the idea that you'd be a division in there? Are you staying in your same place, or are teams cross-pollinating slash working with each other? Meaning, are people being plucked out of, let's just say Becky used to work with John all the time, a different John, John, but now Becky has to work with someone from the new firm. I'm sure they had questions like that as well.
Well, it's an evolutionary process. The first step in the integration process is you want to make sure that nobody takes a step backwards. So there's a lot of research in evaluating salary structures and benefits programs and 401k contributions and bonus structures and all those kinds of things, to make sure that when we do integrate, the new staff doesn't feel like they've lost something in the transaction. So there's a lot of work to be done with that to make sure that it all works. An international firm like DLR has a different set of problems in establishing consistent benefit packages across 30 offices than we had to deal with one office. So there's some complications with that. For the most part, the reasons I believe that we were attractive to them were a couple of key things. One is we're an extremely profitable company and very successful from that standpoint. We run very, very high level systems and processes in the office. For a small firm, we're very, very advanced. The second is that we had a very strong and deep specialization in education. We've been doing education for over 25 years. And although prior to that, we've all done all kinds of different buildings, this is an area of specialization that we like, and we've stuck with it, and we've built some pretty strong relationships throughout California in the education market. We've also demonstrated some extremely progressive planning and design concepts in the education market that's gotten, it's won us a lot of awards. It's gotten us a lot of recognition throughout the state. And I think that brings some characteristics to DLR that I think they found attractive. I think they also were interested in us because I think they really wanted to have a presence in San Diego, which is a very strong market in the development, design, and construction areas. So although we specialize in schools, DLR has work in many, many other market sectors. And so they'd been in the process of making inroads without having a local presence in the San Diego market for a number of years. And so when we combine our work with DLR's work, now we have a significant amount of school work. We have some correctional facilities. We have some hotel projects. We have some mixed use retail projects. So there's a variety of things that now they've got a local office to be able to leverage that into the future.
Did anyone from DLR move down to San Diego from those other specialties?
Not yet. And part of the transition, our initial period of integration is a 3-year window. We just finished our second year. And so for the first 2 years, for the most part, they left us to continue operating the way we have been without imposing a lot of those other things on the office. So as we ramp up to our third year now, we're beginning to have a little bit more focus on how do we start to integrate those other sectors, market sectors, into the San Diego marketplace, and that'll take place over the coming year.
Nice, nice. Well, awesome. I'm glad we went on that tangent. That was fun. Um, what piqued your interest in being part of NCARB, and then what kept your interest about being part of NCARB? Because it's probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's probably not your first year doing stuff for the organization.
No, interestingly enough, I've been involved with NCARB for about 17 years. And prior to that, I had been appointed by the governor to the California Licensing Board, California Architects Board, the CAB, CAB is what we call it out here. I was appointed to that board in 2005. I've been licensed since the mid 80s in the last century, and so hadn't really spent much time with regard to licensure. Just focused on the practice of architecture, and I was invited to apply and was ultimately appointed by the governor. At this time, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger who was governor at the time, who appointed me to the board. And I began to understand what the licensure process was all about with regard to architecture, and how it worked and how complicated it was. And it wasn't so much about architecture as it was about regulation. At that point in time, I had also held an NCARB certificate, which is a certificate to be able to gain reciprocity across the country. And I've been licensed in 10 states over the years for various reasons from time to time, using that certificate. And I'd had a certificate since the mid 80s as well, and never even thought about NCARB during that entire time. Well, when I got onto the California Licensing Board, NCARB played a big role in a lot of what we did. And I didn't understand how complex all the issues were that NCARB participated in. So I started flying around and attending their meetings because I was interested. And over those first few years, I began volunteering for committees and getting involved. So and then ultimately just kind of worked my way through the regional leadership onto the board. And so I've been on the board for, I guess, about 7 or 8 years, as I've started out as a regional director and secretary and treasurer, and moved up in all those chairs until this year.
Awesome. And then how I think about NCARB is that there's a couple major pieces to it, and I'm sure there's more than what I'm aware of, but there's the accreditation of universities, there's the educational experience, tracking and putting together how many hours they are and making sure that all runs smoothly. And then there's the exams. Those are the 3 major pieces I see. Are there more than that? Or how do you look at it?
And you're almost 100% correct.
Ooh, good passing.
The one thing you did mention that NCARB does not do, NCARB is not involved in the accreditation of schools of architecture. That is done by the NAAB, the National Architectural Accrediting Board. And they work with the, refer to it as the Academy, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. And they set the accreditation criteria that schools use to build their curriculum and thereby produce accredited graduates. NCARB's role is really a little different than you might expect. NCARB doesn't even license architects. Licensing of architects is handled at a state jurisdictional level. So there's 55 jurisdictions, including the states and U.S. territories. Each of those jurisdictions is responsible for protecting their health, safety, and welfare of their public. And so they're responsible for licensing the practice of architecture within their borders. And so each state, and then the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and Mariana Islands and all the rest of them. NCARB's role really is to help facilitate all those 55 jurisdictions in the licensure process, and also works with those states on the 3 the three competency areas of licensure, which you mentioned, which is, we refer to it as the three-legged stool, which is a pretty old reference. The education component, the examination component, and the experience component. On the education side, NCARB really just collaborates with the NAB and ACSA and the other organizations, and has some tools to be able to evaluate education of candidates that come from different areas, different countries, from one state to another, in their application for reciprocity from state to state. And so we play sort of a sideline role in the education process from the standpoint of evaluating those criteria from different candidates. On the experience side, NCARB created the AXP program, which is the Architectural Experience Program. It used to be called the Intern Development Program, but the word intern is apparently quite offensive to students, so we don't call them interns anymore. I'm not sure what we call them, but we don't call them interns apparently.
Yeah, there's
so
whole
the
forums
AXP
about it. No, I do.
And-
No one can
And so
remember.
the experience program really says that if you're going to be, if you're going to have a license to practice, and you have to have a certain level of competency, that some of that competency has to come from hands-on experience working
Sure.
under the supervision of a licensed architect. And so there's a certain number of hours that students have to, or candidates have to complete, and they have to complete those hours in certain categorical areas, whether it's the construction administration phase of a project, whether it's in the practice management of a firm, those kinds of things. So the different areas and categories to log hours. And then on the examination portion, NCARB plays the biggest role. NCARB creates the architectural registration exam. We have hundreds of committee members who write exam questions and evaluate exam questions and analyze all that stuff and build the exam forms that go out. And then states under contract to NCARB are allowed to administer that NCARB exam to their candidates for licensure. So the role that NCARB plays really falls into those categories.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like of the three-legged stool. So we're going to talk about the exam and stuff like that. That for some reason I thought that they accredited it, and it seems like there's a little bit of that stool leg might be a little bit shorter than needed for a necessary like 360-degree, not only visual thing, but responsibility, you know. But we'll get into that afterwards. Let me see if I can share my screen here. This came from NCARB itself, which is great. A lot of good data about the tests and all that. So right here we're looking at pass rates, and it has the different tests in there, from construction evaluation all the way to project planning. Project planning is the lowest at 47, and the highest two are project management at 63 and 65 for construction evaluation. And right now, one of the greatest things that I was aware of, we interviewed the last president last year, and NCARB worked on developing more of their practice tests. And there was an improvement in the pass rate based on people taking those practice tests. So right now, the average is 55% across all divisions. No change in going up or down between all of them. I think it did increase some on the construction evaluation. Pass rates on first attempts were higher. And then here we go. 69% of candidates use practical exam before taking the related divisions. 12% average pass rate increase after using practice examination. So I think that that's a great move in the right direction. And I think I just have one slide here. The last slide, this is candidates see highest pass rate immediately after completing the AXP, which is your experience hours. So for people listening, it has all the different tests, and then it basically goes through time on the other axis, and it starts on the left-hand side with the least amount of experience of less than 33%, and those are the lowest pass rates. And then it goes to about, you're a third through your hours, and you're probably at the 75 to 99% of your hours. And then there's a line, and then it's 3 months after you complete your hours, 4 months to 12 months, and a year plus. And the best range is 0 to 3 months. The pass rates are 76%, 61, 70, 72, 72, 67, and it makes complete sense, especially when you look at the left-hand side of people that have less than a third of their hours. I mean, 60%, 43, 47, 47, 58, 40%. It's you just don't know, like you're just getting into architecture, you're drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot going on. Not only is there a lot going on in your firm, but there's a lot going on in studying. People's lives are transitioning out of college and stuff like that. But this is, I think this chart is probably one of the best charts to look at to examine, what's happening. Because if you just look at the overall pass rate where the average is 55%, it's concerning. It's concerning to me as an architect. It's concerning to me as part of the community. It's concerning to me as someone. I'm on the board of our local charter school. If I saw those numbers and consistent those numbers, not only would I work to improve it, but I would hold people accountable that couldn't approve it. People would be fired. This is unacceptable for people who go through, like in my case, for people on the school board who have all the resources and have all the students and all that. So what I want to talk about and kind of examine are some strategies to or some thoughts about improving this. And one of them would be, the easiest is not allowing people to waste their time and money and their sanity on taking these tests when they have less than a third of the hours in there. They have less than a 50% chance on average of passing them. And what also is in the data is that people are taking the tests less than before. They're not taking them as much, and they're probably disheartened by some of it. I've talking to people in other professions in engineering and in medical as well, because they have to take tests as well, and their pass rates are higher. And one of the reasons I bring up that three-legged stool is because NCARB doesn't seem to have all the authority that I thought it did. Meaning, if these test rates are at 55%, you could look at a couple different areas. One, you could look at experience. It seems like experience is what's moving the needle. It seems like that experience category is what's really, really helping. The second, you could look at the tests themselves, and that would where you'd individually look at which tests have a low pass rate. And understand why. Maybe it's the way things are worded, maybe it's some other things. But then the third is that if those two aren't self-evident, you would look at who's being let into these colleges and how these colleges are run. Because if basically, I'm okay with putting burden on students and individuals to basically study and work hard and get the experience they need, and to not lower the standard. I don't want to lower the standard whatsoever. But if NCARB, which they don't, dictated what schools were essentially accredited, which means you control the standards for that, you control the standards for the experience, and you control the standards for the test, it seems frustrating that the average is still at 55. That was a lot.
All those numbers tell us a lot of different things, but I'll try to start at the beginning and just offer some observations. And remember, I'm not a psychometrician, and I'm not even a college graduate, so you got to take what I say with a grain of salt.
Absolutely, and this is all in the best of win-win solutions.
The practice exams, start with that. There are two reasons why they were created. One is to provide reliable study materials for students. So, and then the second is to provide affordable study materials for students, because we'd heard a lot of stories about students spending thousands and thousands of dollars on study materials, which may or may not have been helping them as much as you'd like. So we created the practice exams, and we make them available for free. So if you start a file with NCARB, you're a candidate on the licensure path, even if you haven't done anything yet, but you got a file, you can take the practice exams for free. And it does a couple things for you. It gives you an opportunity to see what you're up against when you do take the real exam, but it also gives you a score report and a lot of information that helps you determine whether or not you're actually ready to take the exam. Shows you where you're strong, shows you where you're weak. Part of the reason why they're able to do that is because of the way we created those practice exams and the way we made them reliable. They are created, and the items and exam questions are written by the same committees that write the A.R.E. These were special exams, were written by the same people and produced and made available as practice exams. So,
which is brilliant.
The way the questions are written, the way the distractors are created so that you think that's the right answer, but it's not the right answer. All of that is done by the same people who write the exam. So the same volunteer pool. So that provides a tool for candidates and I think what you're right is you're seeing less exams sometimes, or it's a slower pace because candidates have figured out that, hey, maybe I should try and see where I am. And if I'm ready, then I'll go ahead. And if I'm not, I'm going to study the areas where I'm weakest first. So the practice exams have played a really great role in that process. The chart that you had that showed would suggest that experience makes a big difference in moving the needle and preparing people for passing the exam. Well, I would tell you that I'd take it a step further and say that experience actually prepares you better for actual practice
100%.
of architecture. And part of the reason is that schools and the NAB and the ACSA specifically state that they're not in the business of preparing students for practicing architecture. They believe that's a vocational aspect of the profession, and that the profession should teach you how to practice, and that their job is to create creative design thinkers and teach you how to create and design. And so so for all of us in the room here who are licensed architects, we look at that and scratch our heads and say, well, that design's a big part of what we do, but all the other stuff that aren't taught in schools as much as we think they should are also very important. And some would say maybe even a little more important from the standpoint of protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Knowing how to put a building together, knowing how engineering gets integrated into a building, knowing how to manage the construction process, and all those things that go into the practice of architecture. And so there is a role that schools play in that process. And there are always going to be students who are going to take the academic route, and an accredited education is never going to be something that we're going to try to disband or say it's not of any value. But we do believe that the experience component of gaining competency hasn't got as much airtime as it should have over the years.
And that's why I'm so glad when we have these conversations, because two of the critical things that I wish everyone that's studying for these could take away from this, one is those practice exams from NCARB are worth it. And I hope that if you get, let's just say, I don't know, does it tell you when you take a practice if you pass the practice exam?
Oh, totally. It gives you an entire score report, tells you how you did on each question and what the right answer is and why the right answer is the right answer, why your answer was not. There's a lot of data.
So the correlation should be studied of, passing those and passing the exam. And that is way different than before. And like you said, the burden of spending thousands of dollars on materials is terrible because they're probably doing that because the pass rate is so low. So the first major thing is that people should take the NCARB practice exam. And the second thing that they should do is, if I was advising them, is not burden yourself with taking them too early. Once you have your experience hours, 0 to 3 months, you're at the 70-something% pass rate, which is very in line with other professions, or just some people take tests differently. The tests are meant to be difficult. Those two things I think would be a huge relief to people, if they follow those two kind of simple rules.
I totally agree. There's a part of this profession, and there's a lot of material in our exams that are experience based and practice based, and schools don't they don't teach to the test. They don't want to teach to the test. And that's the reason why the experience program exists. That's why we created internships. That's why we created the IPAL program, which you may have heard about, the integrated practice path licensure, was created to allow accredited schools to integrate the examination and the experience program into their curriculum, so that students are taking part-time internships while they're in school and applying the knowledge that they're learning in school and starting to understand how this stuff actually manifests out in the real world.
Yep. And I'm seeing schools really step up their practicality as well. I teach at CU Boulder, thus the shirt. Me and Coach Prime are best friends, even if he doesn't know it. And in the morning before class, two students were talking to each other. It's an architectural engineering department, and they have to make this popsicle bridge thing. And there's a design team, and then there's a construction team. And the construction team can ask for RFIs and all that. But if it fails, whatever stress test they have to put on it, that team then has to go to mitigation against the professor. And I asked if real world consequences, like, yeah, whoever, if it fails, and if the mitigation shows that they did something wrong, their grade gets docked. Which is, it's better to learn that process and everything in the safer environment of school, and that doesn't directly apply. But is there anything else before we move on, because there's this new exciting thing about NCARB developing multiple paths, but the tests themselves, and some of the gripes that I hear the most about is the emphasis on project management and contracts, when so many people who are taking this, yes, you are licensed after you're done. The moment you get licensed, I'd like to see if there's a number about the percentage of people that actually just go ahead and start their own firm. My guess is that it would be low. And my guess is that their experience, why that test and why those are so hard for people, is because me as a firm owner, I'm not going into the technical documents of contracts with people that are 0 to 3 years. It's just overload on themselves. It doesn't apply. And also, we own our own contracts, so we don't even use AIA contracts. So it seems to be a continual sticking point in gripe, and I think it's just a mismatch, because we're seeing experience matters, but we can't firm technicalities of contracts doesn't come until you're really in it day in and day out. You can be in construction documents in your third year. You can be in DDs in your second year. You can be in SDs in your third year. But that seems like another disconnect that, again, I want to harp on it because I think it's serious, because I don't think a lot of people think NCARB is listening when they say, we went to school, we got good grades, we studied hard. We got out of school, I study hard. I work at a job, I get good reviews, and I cannot pass these tests. That's difficult to hear.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you that there are some disconnects. I'm not sure I would say that I see the same disconnects that you see.
Oh, what do you see?
And here's where I would start. The exams and the AXP were revised a number of years ago into these 6 categories, 2 of which are not necessarily building related. One is project management. Yep. And which there's a lot of tasks and responsibilities that go into that category, but a lot of recent graduates aren't really in a position where they're going to manage a project, but there's still important skill sets. And the other is practice management. Practice management touches on all the ugly things that you just mentioned, contracts and HR and financial management and all the stuff that you think for the most part most people aren't going to be exposed to. But here's the rub: when you get licensed, regardless of when you do it. When the day you get licensed, you are authorized by your jurisdiction to practice architecture. And you have to do it in an ethical, professional way that protects the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And so because you're licensed to practice, whether you decide to do it or not, you have to have the competencies to understand the aspects of all of those components. Because if for some reason if somebody comes up to you and says, you're an architect, I'd like to have you design a building for me, where do we start? And if you've decided I'm not interested in learning about contracts until later in my career, well, that's going to be inconvenient, because one of the places you're going to start is with a contract. So there are competencies that you have to have, even if you're not necessarily going to use them right away. In practice, in an office, one of the things that that I see, people in the early stage of their career, they don't negotiate contracts. They're not developing fee proposals. They're not building project budgets and things like that. But they certainly should understand that aspect of the project they're working on. They should be able to look at the fee and the project budget that they are tasked with participating in, and understand how much time they have to deliver the work. And is there a match between that and the scope of work that I think I'm going to have to draw? And can I get this done within those numbers of hours? There's some legal obligations that everybody should take time to read, and very seldom does anybody do it. Understanding, what does the contract say my deliverables are at these different phases? And what are the things I'm obligated to do that if I don't do, I could be fired, or it could be a breach of contract, or worse. And so what I tell people all the time, in my office, and it's always been this way, all of our contracts and fees and budgets are all available to all of our staff anytime they want to see it.
Same.
I tell them, here's the project you're working on. Go look through the contract. If there are things in there that you find that you aren't sure about, oh, come see me. We'll sit and I'll talk to you about it. I'll explain why they're in there. You see very few people actually take the time to do that. And it goes to where I see one of the disconnects, and it's this. Students have a path to licensure. They go to school, they do what their instructors say. I did all the assignments, I got really good grades, I did all this stuff. Why can't I pass the exam? You got to own your career path. You got to own the responsibilities for your success, which means you have to really evaluate what you're being told in school and the things you're being taught, and think about, okay, are there parts of this practice in this profession that I'm not being told about, that I need to do some special studying on my own because I'm interested in learning it? And the answer is yes. And so to some extent, a lot of people don't take that accountability for their own obligation to own their career path on their own. So because I didn't go to school, I had to decide how am I going to develop the competencies to practice architecture. So I did a number of things to working in different size firms, working on different size projects, asking lots of questions. If I didn't understand things about contracts, I would study contracts. I'd pull contracts out and I'd read them, and I'd go bug people and ask them questions about it until they were tired of me asking questions, because I wanted to learn all of that stuff. And so you have to want to learn all of that to really become competent. But at the end of the day, the exams and the experience that we require of candidates for initial licensure has to cover all the bases that they're responsible for, because the very next day they could go out and take responsibility for a client's projects, and they better be competent to do it right, or they're not going to be a licensed architect for very long.
Yep. And I agree with that. And I think some of the problems maybe in the past was people would state, hey, I am learning on my own. I am buying different books. I am buying $1,000 worth of study materials. But now, this conversation, not all people are going to go and look through the NCARB website and look at all their graphs like we brought up and all that, and say that, hey, your experience does matter. And maybe you shouldn't be taking your test until you're at least 75% complete. I would like NCARB to think about not letting people tests until they're over 33%, because there's, I mean, those pass rates are terrible. And they're setting, you know, anyways, and then also developing your own test, and can continue to improve on that, and that study guide are very helpful. So I think we covered that to a good amount.
Okay.
Before we leave, I do want to cover these multiple pass. It's very fitting, since yourself are not a university graduate, that NCARB is looking into more of these pass to become an architect. So can you talk about those?
Sure. The majority of jurisdictions for initial licensure require an accredited degree from a school of architecture. And that was always culturally, that's what our profession supported for a lot of years. 17 jurisdictions allow licensure through a multiple of different pathways by exchanging experience for education. So, for instance, in my case, California is one of those 17 states. So in California, I have an 8-year window, and I have to have 8 years of combined education and experience to be able to sit for the exam to become licensed. That can look like 5 years of education and 3 years of experience, or it can look like 2 years of education and 6 years of experience, or it could look like 8 years of experience. Mm-hmm. And that flexibility was helpful to me because you know, I didn't grow up in an affluent family that had resources. There was the few years that I tried to go to college, worked 40 hours a week. It was very, very difficult. There was not much time for you know, activities such as sleeping and things of that nature. And it's tough. You know, you work graveyard at a 7-Eleven, and then you get up and you go to school after you leave your workplace, and you go to school all day. And at some point, you have to figure out where I'm going to get a couple hours of sleep to be able to, you know, perform. I think there's a lot of people who are in that situation. They don't have the resources to be able to go to an accredited school and pay the tuitions. And so it's not to say that the majority of people might still do that, but there ought to be pathways that are supported universally across the country to support people who either don't have resources or they learn in a different way than in an academic setting.
And they
so
might. Sorry to interrupt, but I want to interrupt and say they might not want to burden themselves down with that much debt.
Well, there's that too. And there's actually a little bit of a national wave right now going across the country about the cost of higher education. Yeah. And it's not just the architectural profession.
Sure. Yeah, of
course. Whether or not your starting salary is satisfactory to be able to start paying down that debt. And in many cases, it's not. Yeah. And so that is a big burden. But at the end of the day, 30% of our jurisdictions allow multiple pathways. Our goal is that all jurisdictions would allow those multiple pathways at an equal level, with some ability to trade experience for education or otherwise. We've got about 165 or so community college architectural programs across the country. Those are 2-year programs. The students in those 2-year programs, some get a certificate, some get an AA degree, some don't get anything. They're not accredited as an architectural school for licensure. They're not highly recognized or otherwise within the profession. And they're not even an organized group in many ways, like the accredited schools of architecture are. But the work that those students do in those 2 years is a really great balance between design and planning and analysis and design thinking, as well as code research and constructability and systems integration and all those other aspects. So they come out of those 2-year programs with a fairly solid competency level of understanding the planning and design process and how buildings go together. And from those programs, they can transfer to an accredited school if the accredited school will give them 2 years worth of credit, and many of them won't, which is not reasonable. And then there's a lot of those students who are going to community college because they can't afford to do anything else. And so what do they do next? Do they have the right combination of of competencies to be able to leave the 2-year program and get an entry-level position with a firm. And so I actually have a work group right now that's developing a workforce readiness competency standard that says, what are the competency standards necessary for entry-level employment with an architectural firm, so that can be built into to support those 2-year programs at community colleges for those students.
Absolutely. Agree wholeheartedly with the practicality of that thought and the mission that's going on there. That wraps it up for me. I'll leave you with any other thought that you want to talk about that we didn't cover, and any kind of plugs of where people can go to get more information or anything like that.
Well, anybody who's in the licensure pathway or even practicing and is interested in an NCARB certificate, the NCARB website is pretty easy to navigate and has a lot of good information. The customer service staff at NCARB is also very, very helpful. And if you've got a unique situation, you went to school in Italy and you're trying to figure out how to get a license in the U.S., the customer service staff at NCARB understand a lot of the intricacies of those programs, and you can present your own unique situation. They can help you through that process. So there's a lot of good things with that. I would say that 2 things. One is, like you say, the way you practice, take practice exams and things before you go to get licensed. But I would encourage anybody who's thinking about the licensure path to do it, and do it sooner than later. Don't wait until you're 20 years in the profession and you have 3 kids and a mortgage, and it's much more difficult. Get licensed. It gives you options in your future to decide how you want to lead your career at that point in time. And the only other thing I'd say is, to this day, I've been practicing for 45 years and I love this business. It's given me the privilege of doing some great things, and I can drive by projects that I designed and built 35 years ago, and it still gives me a great deal of pride and satisfaction that I've been able to have the privilege of doing things for society that is really meaningful for communities. So
awesome.
It's all good stuff.
Well, thanks for coming on Inside the Firm, Jon.
Happy to participate. Thanks for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure.